the fact that African American rates of homeownership in the United States have been relatively the same from 1968 until today kind of undermines the notion that this idea of the American dream is available to Black people. One of the things that I remember most starkly moving to Chicago was literally driving into the city from east to west. And, we're on the highway for a while, and then eventually we got off the highway to drive up to the neighborhood that we were moving to. And one of the immediate things that I recognized was that for maybe 40 blocks, city blocks, everyone was Black. And, I moved to Chicago, I'm living there, and we were living on the south side of Chicago, near the University of Chicago, so not in the kind of densely Black African American portion of the south side, but up against it. And after a year or two, the degree of segregation, racial segregation in Chicago, is overwhelming and unmistakable. And when you look at Chicago, the segregation is so thorough that it can't just be a reflection of individual choices and desires about where they want to live. I think in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed, which made discrimination against Black people in buying or selling or renting housing in the U.S. Was made illegal, but the numbers have not increased. One of the things that we have seen more recently in the aftermath of the financial crisis is that homeownership in general has become much more complicated. And so your personal ability to accumulate wealth really determines the quality of your life and your children's life. And Black people's marginalization from homeownership and the ways in which their property does not accrue in value in the same ways that it does for white families, continues to leave Black people at a disadvantage. I will say, though, that the overwhelming focus on Black access to home ownership has also helped to stifle a bigger question, which is about the generalized sense of housing precarity in the United States. So in my book, Race for Profit, I use this concept of predatory inclusion to really draw attention to the terms under which Black people finally go from being marginalized and excluded from home ownership to being included, and how the lack of repair, reckoning, restoration from decades of legal discrimination, right? That Black people are legally discriminated against by the federal government in the US from 1934 until 1968. And there are consequences to that legal discrimination. It means that there is a kind of systematic lack of investment, not just lack of investment, disinvestment in the neighborhoods and areas where Black people were moving into over the course of what is known in the United States as the Great Migration. The areas, the neighborhoods, the communities that Black people are moving into are systematically disinvested from. And it means that housing in these areas is old and dilapidated. And so the exclusion of Black people from the mortgage market, meaning they could not buy property, went further than that. It meant that they were also not eligible for what were called home improvement loans. So even if you come into property through some means, that you don't have the actual tools to maintain the property. You don't have the tools to fix the property. And so there's tremendous aging and dilapidation in Black neighborhoods that gets worse over time. And then the exclusion and discrimination is made illegal and officially ends in 1968. And so those conditions that were created by decades of legal discrimination then become the explanation for banks and other kinds of lenders to treat Black people differently, to treat them as what they describe as subprime, as risky, and that creates the pretext for treating them differently within the market, meaning charging them more for the same services, charging them higher rates of interest for the same services because they are deemed to be risky. So predatory inclusion is about the ways that racial discrimination creates the conditions for Black consumers to be treated in ways that open them up, that make them vulnerable to exploitative practices, whether it's real estate, whether it's banking. It makes them ripe for exploitation because of the way discrimination has allowed them to be now treated as risky ventures for business. As early as 1917, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, which was the trade organization of real estate agents in the United States, had as its policy that any realtor, which is what they called themselves, that interrupted the racial homogeneity, so introduced someone of a different race into a neighborhood, would lose their right to practice real estate, would no longer be able to be a real estate agent. And so this was long before the US government ever had anything to do with the housing market. And so the US government calls on that organization and organizations like it to create its rules and regulations. So conceptually, existentially, its policies are embedded with the private real estate interests, with banking interests, and with the idea of projecting a housing market. Because there's so much housing inequity in the US, there are lots of examples of creativity and, people really engaged in important struggles against this. So there are examples of, most recently, for me, I'd like the story of this organization called Moms for Housing, which are these Black working class women on the west coast of the United States in Oakland, California, who really took over houses in the Bay Area in Oakland for families in need of housing, for houses that were sitting there empty, accruing value, and developers waiting until the top of the market to flip the houses. The problem is there's no shortage of creativity, bravery in this activism. The problem is scale, that the housing crisis in the United States is so profound that without some level of state intervention, that we just can't have the amount of housing that is needed to deal with the depth of the crisis. So there has to be a different kind of struggle